So after the Civil War, the American South was supposed to get this big, fresh start. We're talking about the New South era, running from about 1877 to 1898. And what makes this time so absolutely fascinating and so important to understand is this deep paradox at its very core. On one hand, you've got this incredible vision for a modern industrial future. But on the other, you have the brutal reality of economic oppression and the deliberate rebuilding of white supremacy. It's a massive contradiction. The slogan was basically smokestacks over cotton fields. The idea was a clean break from the old agrarian past. But for millions of Southerners, both black and white, what they actually lived felt a lot more like a new kind of slavery, this inescapable cycle of debt and control. And that gap, right there between the promise and the reality, that is the story of the New South. So let's unpack it. All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at that promise of progress, that shiny vision of an industrialized South. Then, we're going to dive into the harsh reality of oppression that was happening at the exact same time. After that, we'll explore the ongoing struggle and resistance against that oppression. And finally, we'll try to sort through what it all means and look at its very complicated legacy. Okay, so first up, let's talk about that optimistic vision. This was a really powerful sales pitch for a modernized South, one that was supposedly eager to get back into the nation's economy and put the devastation of the Civil War in the rearview mirror. And the guy at the heart of this, the main cheerleader, was Henry Grady. As the editor of the Atlanta Constitution, he was basically the chief evangelist for this new South. His message, aimed especially at investors up north, was crystal clear. Hey, the South is open for business, we're ready for capitalism, we're diversifying, we're building. It was all about looking forward, reconciliation, and, let's be honest, making a profit. And this wasn't just hot air. There were real, tangible signs of progress. For the first time ever, textile mills in the South actually started to outproduce the old industrial hubs up in New England. The railroad network just exploded across the region, finally connecting all those resources to the markets. And you had cities like Birmingham, Alabama popping up, they called it the Pittsburgh of the South, pumping out tons of iron and steel. So what was really drawing all that northern cash down south? Was it just the resources, the iron, and the timber? Not really. The real magnet, the secret sauce, was the promise of an incredibly cheap and easily controlled workforce. This whole vision of modernization was fundamentally built on keeping labor costs at rock bottom, and that meant crushing unions and keeping a tight grip on workers, both black and white. But okay, while the newspapers in Atlanta and Birmingham are celebrating all this progress, the reality for most people on the ground was a totally different story. And this is where that dream of a new South just collides head-on with a pretty grim economic and racial reality. Just take a look at this. Despite all the talk about factories and smokestacks, the Southern economy was still overwhelmingly agricultural. We're talking 80%. That means for the vast majority of people, life was still tied to the land. In a lot of ways, King Cotton still ruled, trapping the entire region in a really volatile global market. That modernization just wasn't reaching the countryside. And for all those folks stuck in that farming economy, their survival often depended on this devastating system called the crop lien. Now, the name sounds kind of dry, but the system itself was brutal. It was basically a credit system. A farmer who had no cash would get things like seeds and supplies from a local merchant, but the collateral wasn't land or anything they owned. It was a legal claim on the crops they hadn't even planted yet. And here's how the trap would snapshot. First, you'd get your supplies on credit, but at absolutely insane interest rates. We're talking 50, sometimes even 100%. The merchant had the legal claim, the lien on your future harvest. So at the end of the year, after the merchant took his huge cut, the value of your crop almost never covered your total debt. You'd start the next year, not at zero, but already deep in the hole. It was a vicious cycle designed to keep people poor and desperate. While this economic trap was closing in, the political world was being completely remade. It all really kicks into high gear with the Compromise of 1877. That's when the federal government pulls its last troops out of the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. Well, this gives a huge green light to these so-called Redeemer governments to just systematically tear down the rights that African Americans had won. And it all leads to this monumental Supreme Court case, Plessy v. Ferguson. And there it is, the infamous legal fiction that would justify segregation for over half a century. The Supreme Court decided that state-mandated segregation was totally constitutional, as long as the separate facilities for black and white people were equal.
Of course, equal was a complete fiction. They were never equal. But this ruling gave states the legal cover they needed to impose Jim Crow laws on absolutely everything: trains, schools, even water fountains.
And look, this wasn't just about segregation. It was about systematically taking away political power. States got real creative, using a whole toolbox of tricks to stop black men from voting. Think about it: poll taxes that you couldn't possibly afford, literacy tests designed to be impossible for anyone to pass, and these really clever grandfather clauses, which said if your ancestor could vote before the Civil War, you were exempt, which of course only applied to white voters. And we have to be brutally honest about how this new social order was enforced. It was enforced with sheer terror. In just one decade, the 1890s, over 1,000 African Americans were lynched. These were not just random acts of violence. They were often public spectacles, a horrifying tool used to enforce the racial hierarchy and punish anyone who dared to challenge the status quo. So, when you're faced with this kind of legal, economic, and violent assault, what do? Did people just give up? No way. Absolutely not. And that is the crucial counter-narrative here. This was also an era of incredible resilience, of smart, strategic thinking, and of constant struggle. The resistance had to adapt, but it never, ever stopped. I mean, you just have to look at the courageous work of Ida B. Wells. She was a journalist who didn't just report on lynchings, she investigated them. She used facts, data, and interviews to completely dismantle the lies that were used to justify these murders, exposing them for what they were: acts of economic and political terrorism. And after her own newspaper office was burned to the ground, she took her campaign international to show the whole world what was happening in America. This brutal reality sparked a really intense and important debate within the Black community about the best way to move forward. You had these two very different strategies pop up. On one side, you had leaders like Booker T. Washington, who argued for focusing on vocational skills and economic self-sufficiency first. The belief was that if you could prove your economic worth, political rights would eventually follow. But then you had leaders like Bishop Henry McNeil Turner, who was so disillusioned that he argued America was fundamentally racist, and that true freedom could only be found by emigrating back to Africa. And through all of this, you just can't overstate how vital Black institutions were. Churches, schools, community aid societies, businesses, they were so much more than just parallel structures. They were sanctuaries. They were the centers for community life, for cultural pride, for self-help, and they were the organizing hubs for resistance in an environment designed to crush any sense of Black autonomy. Okay, so let's pull back. If we put all these pieces together, what are we left with? What is the real legacy of the New South? How on earth do we reconcile these two completely opposite stories? One of amazing progress and the other of terrible oppression. It really does come back to this fundamental contradiction. The industrial vision was real. The railroads got built, the factories went up, but it all happened right alongside, and you could even argue it depended on, the lived reality of crushing farm debt and the violent enforcement of a new racial order. The talk of economic progress was often just a convenient way to hide or even justify some really deep social oppression. Which leaves us with a really tough, lingering question to think about. If the New South's whole economic model, all those factories and railroads, if it all depended on keeping labor cheap and suppressed through debt and Jim Crow violence, then was that industrial growth really replacing the old system of racial hierarchy, or was it just reinforcing it in a new, modern-looking disguise? That's the question that really sits at the heart of this complicated and powerful era.